Let's do a eval. Docker ps-a. I believe they're all down. Yeah, let's do a rebuild. So that is up. And all of those things. I'm not sure it needs to do a full. No, that's fine. Docker ps-a. It's back. Woohoo! Excellent. Happy Tuesday. Just had to double check there. It was Tuesday. Happy Tuesday. Happy coding, and welcome to another How to Code Well live stream. Today we're going to be working on the model layer. The model layer of our object-oriented framework in PHP that we're creating. This framework will be for an invoice application. We're not using any libraries apart from the libraries we use to test with. So PHP unit and Codeception and other bits like that, like PHP stan and so forth. We've built the routing. The routing is working fine, so you can click through, and you can also have parameterized URLs as well, and they get put back to the view. So the controller stroke view is pretty much there. I mean, yes, there still needs to be a bit of tinkering around. There was a couple of issues I had that are yet to be resolved, but the most part, it is all working. We also last week got code coverage coming back, which is fantastic because that gives me a bit of confidence, and it gives me some insight as to what parts of the code hasn't been tested, what are the risky parts, and so forth. We also attempted to update the version of PHP. We were a little bit adventurous, and we went for PHP 7.4. It didn't quite work out because we needed the Xdebug installed, and there was some problems with that. I'm pretty sure if I was able to give myself a good few hours, I might be able to come up with a solution for that. But we managed to get it to PHP 7.3, and I'm very happy with this. It's all in Dockerized. You probably just saw me start up these containers. What we're going to do first of all is we're just going to make sure that the tests run. So we're going to just bring that up here, and I'm just going to Control C, go back to a new line, and let's clear that down, make some room. Let's do a run, and you can see that we have the code coverage running here. We're not going to worry too much about code coverage today, so we're just going to knock that back and just run all the units. Zoom. Okay, so we got 46 tests. They've all passed, 61 assertions. Fantastic. So that's good. I want to try and do that every time I start a stream just to make sure that I haven't broken anything. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to start on the model layer. The model layer is where basically all the meat of this application, of the data flow and the sort of the way the data is mapped to the database. You may have heard us saying you have skinny controllers and fat models. So a controller should really only be dealing with the request and the response. The model should be dealing with the guts of how the data is interpreted, the behavior of that data, and so forth. So what we're going to focus on first is, well, we haven't actually created any entities. We're going to focus on the entities today, and this is just a excuse me, a blank entity. We have an abstract entity here, and let's open that up and see what's going on here. So this is just some placeholders, really. We have the ID, date created, date updated, and then we have some getters and we have some setters. That's all good. And the reason why I did that is because we're going to have more than one entity, and each entity will require these things. So a creation date, an updated date, and an ID. So we can extend from this abstract entity. But today we're going to start to build the invoice entity, because after all, this is an invoicing application. And we're going to try and do it as much as possible in a test-driven development kind of manner. So we're not going to build our entity first. We're going to create the test for it. So we're going to create a failing test. So in unit, we're just going to create a new folder here called new file directory. We're going to call this entity. And I'm just going to grab one of these things and copy one of those just because I'm lazy, paste it in there. We're going to call this Invoice Test, like so. Okay, let's fiddle around with the namespaces. So this is entity, and this is, no, that should be fine. And this is obviously the invoice. Wonderful. Okay, so we have before, we have after, we have defaults. We're going to just strip out all of this stuff because this is testing other bits. Let's put in a group. We're going to do this as entity for the first group. Second group, we're going to have, because we might want to test all the entities together, we might want to test the invoice separately, and we therefore, and we might also want to test the invoice default separately too. Okay, so we're going to first of all create a default for the invoice. So test default, we're going to instantiate a new class, and this is going to be called invoice. Now, I haven't created the invoice entity at all. As you've seen, the entity in here, the entity folder is totally blank in the type. So it's completely empty. This is going to obviously fail because the invoice class doesn't work. However, the beauty of doing it in this manner in a test-driven way is it changes your thinking to think about how the invoice is going to or should be set up by default. So what happens when you just instantiate a new invoice class? What are the properties that are available to me? What are the methods that are available to me? And so on and so forth. And what are the default values? That's important. So if we think about what is in an invoice, let's just remove that. We have mechanisms perhaps to set a customer, to add a invoice item, to add or to set a reference, to generate the totals and all of that other good stuff, and obviously to update the creation date and the updated date. If you think of it from the perspective of a database, then you obviously have an ID, so you for the primary keys and other bits and pieces as well. For the default test, though, I just like to think of the object in a read-only state. So what is the things that I can actually read from a blank invoice object? So in my opinion, and this is going to be different for, I mean, this, first of all, I should say that this will never be a production-ready application. And we're only going to be using a handful of entities for this. So in my opinion, the bare minimum of what an invoice can do should have the ability to get a customer. So we have get customer, and when we're thinking of it from a completely blank invoice, right? So let's just say we've created an invoice and perhaps it's a draft invoice. Well, we're not going to have a customer to begin with because we are yet to assign a customer to the invoice. So get customer, we're going to do a this assert null get customer, because that's either going to be null or it's going to be the entity of the customer that is assigned to this invoice. So I want to ensure that the default property or the default the method get customer returns null on the first load. Okay, the second thing I'm going to check is that we have an array of invoice items. Now obviously when we start creating the invoice, we don't actually have any invoice items to add to this invoice, but we have an array. It's a blank array, sure, but it's an array of invoice items. So we have get items, and this is assert is array, and we could even go one step further and say is, whoops, hang on, if I can remember what it is empty. So it's an array and it's an empty array. So this is me trying to decide what the properties should, what the data types of the properties should be, and how the invoice should be when we first instantiate a completely blank invoice. The second thing, or the third thing I should, well, no, yeah, the third thing, if I can move that mouse, could be the reference, right? So we might want to get a reference, and that reference, let's make a decision now as to how the reference should be. Should it be an integer? Should it be a string? Should it be a blank string to begin with? Should there be a default in there? I think it should be a string, and I don't think there should be a default, so I think it should just be an empty string. So get reference. Now you could use same, or you could just do this. You could do is, so you check the data type, so is string, and you could also then do another one underneath this to make sure that that string is empty. Now you might be looking at this and going, oh my God, you're going completely overboard here. You know, you haven't even written a single line of code that works, but this is how I develop when I start working through how these entities should hang together. Because if you try and think in your head of the most complicated data structure that you've ever worked on, and you try and map that out in your head, it's tricky. It's very tricky. When you're doing it in a test-driven development kind of manner like this, you're asking yourself questions as you go. So the question I just asked there, so is reference a string or is it an integer? Well, I've decided it's a string, and therefore I'm going to check that it's a string. So you go about sort of building in your head this map of this data as it should hang together. Just going to take a slurp of my tea. Okay. So what else can an invoice have assigned to it? So we have the customer, we have items, we have a reference. There also needs to be perhaps a total. Now the total could be generated on the fly based on the items that you have, but I think that it's always good to store the total somewhere in the invoice. So we also have assert get total. And this is going to be, when we just create an invoice, the total is going to be 0. So we're going to assert that it is an integer, is int, because it's 0, and we don't want 0 to be just deemed as a Boolean. It's not a Boolean, it's an integer. So assert is int, get total. And we also want to assert that the total is actually, so we do same 0. So this is going to force us to have a property called total that has 0 as its first, as the default. We also have perhaps tax, and we also perhaps have a status. So with the tax, let's do. So I could do get VAT, and we're also checking that that is the same as well. The status I mentioned just a minute ago. So we could have a status on the invoice. So paid, it could be awaiting payment, it could be overdue, it could be in a draft state, it could be in a sent state. So we have a status, but how do we go about dealing with this? Because this is where we start looking at the relationships of the objects. We have a relationship of the invoice to the customer, and that's going to be a one-to-many. So one invoice could have, or one invoice will be for one customer. So That could be perhaps a one-to-one, although I'm not too keen on one-to-ones. Then we have, with the status, we could have the invoice actually can have multiple statuses, so that would be a one-to-many. So we would have, if we think about the data structure, the schema, we are going to have a status ID in the invoice record, and the status ID would go off to be linked to associate itself with a status. Now, when we first instantiate this invoice, I could either pass in through dependency injection the status in which I want this invoice to start with, or I could say, well, if an invoice doesn't have a status to begin with, then that itself is a status of draft, perhaps. These are all questions that I'm yet to sort of like formalize and answer in my head. Same with the customer. I might want to instantiate the invoice passing in the customer as well, or I might want to assign a blank invoice to a customer at a later date. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that you can have an invoice that doesn't have a status straight away, because I think that when the invoice is saved, and if it doesn't have a status, then a status needs to be added to it. So I think that's all right. So we're going to pretty much copy the customer here. So we're going to get that, and we're going to put that down here. So this is going to be get status. So the status is going to be null, or it's going to be an ID. So, it's going to be the part of the status. Now, one thing I should have mentioned is that this is just a holder, if you will, for all the data that's in the database. There's going to be a hydrator that we're going to create later on, a hydration mechanism that will hydrate this entity based on the records that are in the database. So in the hydration method, there will be some logic as to making these kind of decisions. And the hydration will also do things perhaps that will go through all of the items within the invoice and will generate and set the totals, possibly. Maybe I need to think about that stuff later on. What I like doing with these tests is you can sort of compartmentalize each sort of like process in this application, in this framework. Okay, so that's a lot of tests that we've created here for default. Let's just go through them. We've got get customer, so that's going to be a customer record or null. Get items is going to be an array, and that's going to be an empty array to begin with. We've got get reference, that must be a string, and it's going to be empty to begin with as well. Get total, that is going to be an integer, and that will be a 0. So that'll be 0. And then we have VAT, same with get total. So that will be a integer, and that also will be 0. And then we have status, which is going to be null by default. So is that enough for the invoice? Obviously, I need to create the customer entity, and I need to create the status entity as well. We'll probably add some other bits and pieces as well to those. But is that enough, the ballpark, the minimum for the invoice? Yeah, I think, yeah. Okay, I think for now it's a good start. Of course, if I run these tests, it's going to fall flat on its face because none of this is actually running. And this is the beauty of the test-driven development. You can actually, this is broken now because I need to create these things in order for them to work, and they need to follow these rules for it to work. These rules have been decided. That's the whole decision process of test-driven development. Okay, so let's go ahead and create this and make this test work. So I'm just going to open this out, and I'm just going to grab some of my drink. Right. Up we go. So we're going to put it in type. Yeah. So there's an interesting discussion on Twitter at the moment that I've seen recently, with folder structures. And I was thinking about my folder structures and how terrible they are, and how confusing they can get. Maybe I need to remove type from this. I don't know. Maybe I should call it invoice entity and then put that within the entity folder. Yeah, I'm not going to worry about refactoring, but look. If you look at this abstract term helper and then open that up, you've got, all sorts of, and then HTTP, you've got all sorts of things in here, which are crazy. Then validation, then you've got type. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 folders just to get down to this. Could I do it in a better way? Probably. Do I need these types? Probably not. Does this feel more comfortable in my head? Yes, it does. Is this working? Yes, it is. So I'm going to just keep with this, but in the back of my mind, I think that, I could go for a big refactor. There's no need for this to be in the helper anymore. This could just go straight up into the SRC folder. Helper was just something that I wanted to sort of like have a collection of all of these things, so the kernel and the HTTP. But to be honest, they are their own first-class citizens within the SRC. There's no need to put them in the helper. The helper doesn't do anything. It doesn't add any value. It's just technical debt. But anyway, enough of that rant. Let's go on to the invoice. So I'm just going to copy this. I'm going to bung this in here. I'm going to remove all of these things, and I'm going to do a class. It's not an abstract class, and this is invoice. Now, one thing I've just noticed is that we need to extend, and that's type for some reason, because I choose to put it in the type folder. One thing I've noticed is that we need to extend the abstract entity. Abstract entity, here we go. But we haven't actually tested for anything on the abstract entity. So we haven't tested for any of this stuff, which is something that we need to do. So I'm going to add those tests in quickly. So we go to the invoice tests. Okay, so what I would like is to test the ID. So the ID is going to be an integer. It is also going to be, is it going to be set when we instantiate the object? No, it's not. Is it going to be null then when we first run it? Yes, it is. So we do assert null, get ID. And I need to think about how these entities get hydrated, because obviously an ID as a primary key, it shouldn't be null. It should always be a value, an ID, and that should auto increment from the database. If we're using integers, of course, we could be using GUIDs or what have you. But I need to so I'll probably come back to the ID and work that out. Same with the date. So we have this assert invoice get, and I believe it is. Well, I tell you what I could do. Let's just remove that for now. On here, I could do use. We don't need any of those. We could do use. Actually, let's remove that. And we could do invoice, because now I've created that class, I can do that. So we have this use statement's just been added, which means that I can now access all of these things. So if you notice that the get ID is not grayed out, because that is actually a ID. So we have get, and we've also got, is it date created? Now date created is, I've set this to be either null or or a date time to begin with, which I guess it is, but perhaps we need to have something on the in the constructor to set the date created and the date updated every time that gets ran, perhaps. So I think that's probably a good thing. Although because this is an abstract class, we can't have the constructor within an abstract class, which is why it's an abstract class. So that would have to come through the the public method in Invoice. But then you see we've now got ourselves an architectural question. If we have more than one entity, which we will, because we'll have customers, we'll have statuses and invoice items and so on and so forth, if they all extend the abstract entity, then they're all going to need to set their date created and their date updated. And it would be duplicated code if we were to do that in the constructors of these objects. So one could argue that the abstract entity shouldn't actually be of type abstract, because we should actually have a parent constructor that we call that handles the date created and the date updated. One could argue. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's an architectural issue there that I need to solve. Should it be a date time and not be allowed to be null? And when we instantiate an invoice, should we automatically be setting the date time on these things? That's the question. I think to just get this to run, I think we should just concede that this is going to be null. Same with the date updated, because we might be dealing with a hydration method which hydrates these things. So it might not be the responsibility of the actual model itself to do this. It might be the responsibility of the hydrator when the hydrator gets called, and then we use some sort of factory magic to build the invoice entity. At that point, we could be calling set date created and set date updated, as well as issuing an ID as well, possibly. So all of these questions, they're all huge questions that I'm asking at this point in the project, because I'm dealing with the invoice model. And notice I haven't done any logic for setting anything. It's just a complete blank invoice, which is extending a abstract entity. So yeah, so now we can start actually filling these things out. So what do we need? We need a private reference. That is going to be a blank string. We also need a customer. And that is going to be null. It's going to be null, or it's going to be the customer. Now, I haven't created the customer yet, so I can't put that in yet, because we should only be coding things that are in place. With the tests, I'm perfectly willing to put some broken tests in order to write the code that fix those tests. But when it comes to actually writing the physical code to keep it nice and clean, we shouldn't be adding anything that doesn't exist yet. So we have the customer, that's set to null. What else do we have? We have items. That is going to be an array. Now, it's a shame that we couldn't get PHP 7.4 working, because I would have used the functionality that PHP 7 offers for having type declarations within our properties here. But we couldn't get it to work. So, and I would prefer to have Xdebug working more than having PHP 7.4 working at this present time. So we have reference, we have customer, we have items. What else do we have? I think we've got something else. Of course, we have status. That's what we've got. That is going to be null to begin with. And anything else. So let's go to invoice test. So we've got customers, items, reference. Oh yes, we've got total and we've got VAT. And then we have these dates, which are handled in the abstract entity. So we have the total. Whoops. Come on, I wanted to copy that. Thank you. And that's set to 0. If I can find the 0 on the keyboard. So that is an int. Now, it's not an int, is it? It's a float. So, yeah. Again, that's 0. That is the VAT. So actually, these are floats. So I'm going to just change that to float. And the VAT to float too. And we're going to go into this, and we're going to change the this to be is float. So that's VAT, and we have total. Because it could be £2.50, it could be $5.56, it could be $10,000 and 98 cents. Save that. Okay, grab some tea. Okay, so this is all working good. I'm going to now create the getters and setters for all these things. So in the magic of PHP Storm, I can press Control or Command N, and then we can do getters and setters. I don't think you can see this on the screen. And we can select all the ones we want, make sure we have fluent setters on, and then hit OK. And there we go. That is all built. Our big class is all being built. Now we haven't tested any of the setters. So I could, if I wanted to, Control Z that, press Command N, then do getters and setters. Sorry, not getters and setters. Sorry, Control N, getters, because we should only be working on the things that we've been testing. We shouldn't be adding any code, generating any code that hasn't been tested if we're trying to do a true TDD style type approach. So we have the floats here, that's all good, and we have the statuses, and that's fine. Obviously, I'll need to change the status and the customer when I have those entities in play. But let's go back to the tests. Let's have a look. None of these are now grayed out, so this looks like it's going to work, or it's going to at least call these things. So let's hit save, and then let's run the test and see what's happened. So yep, we have one failure here. We're failed asserting that 0.0 is identical to 0. Well, this is because we've chosen to use a float rather than an int, so that's fine. Let's go back to the totals here. That should be 0.0, and that should be 0.0. And if I was to run this again, I believe it's going to fail. Let's just see, because we've actually set these by default. Oh, no, sorry, we are returning floats. Of course we are, so that's casting that to floats. But what we should do up here is we should just do 0.0 just for clarity's sake. I mean, one could argue that we don't actually need to set any values to these things at all, because the data types are now saying that they are. So there's no need to set that as a blank array, because that is going to be an array. However, just for clarity's sake, we want to make sure that is actually an empty array. So yeah, it's one of those weird things. It's sort of like, do I do the code up here or do I do the code down here? Sometimes I can get away with not having code up here, but sometimes it's worth to do it. And I'm on the side of consistency, so that's how I work. Okay, so that test passed. Let's run that again just to make sure. Yep, that test passed. So we now have our entity. We at least have the getter side of the entity. So now we can work on the setting part. So we've tested that we have the defaults. Now we need to actually test that we can actually set these things and get them back. So we need to check that we can actually get set a reference and return that back, and so forth, which is what we're going to focus on in just a second. Now, before I do, I just want to say that this podcast stroke live stream, it's a live stream, not a podcast, of course, is sponsored by Hostinger. Hostinger has proudly sponsored How to Code Well for these streams. And I'm going to be showing in the future how to set up your hosting on Hostinger. And at the moment they have an 82% off. And if you use the discount code, which is Peter Fisher, all one word, Peter Fisher, then you get an extra 15% off. It also sponsors and helps the channel, which is super awesome. So thank you very much for Hostinger for sponsoring this. Do check out, it's hostinger.com/Peter Fisher. That's my sort of promo code, if you will. And that will give me a little bit of a kickback, which is awesome. So if you're interested in getting a hosting provider, then do check out Hostinger. I've been using them, and they're pretty good. And I've used all sorts of hosting providers in the past, and Hostinger are pretty good, and they've got some really good deals on 82% off at the moment, plus a free domain. And if you use the code Peter Fisher, you get a further 15% off. And I've been playing around with their VPSs recently, and they've been really good, very stable, and quick and easy, sort of intuitive to set up as well. I'm going to be deploying things to Hostinger, and I'm going to be showing you how to do those in sort of future episodes. I'll probably put that on the YouTube channel. But if you're interested in that kind of stuff, then do make sure that you subscribe to How to Code Well, both here on Twitch and on the YouTube channel too. I'll be talking about Hostinger in these streams and how Hostinger can be used to host your project and your application, and how you can spin up Hostinger VPSs as well. So do check out Hostinger, hostinger.com/Peter Fisher. Get 82% off of your hosting plus a free domain. If you use the discount code Peter Fisher, then you get a further 15% off. So, I mean, it's an awesome price to have a project hosted on the web. So do check them out. They're a really good hosting provider in the US. So thank you very much for Hostinger for sponsoring this channel. Also, I should mention that we have a podcast every Friday. And every Friday I've been interviewing awesome people in the web development and programming community. I think we're up to like 22 guests now. I've been interviewing. Last Friday we had Emma Vidkind, and she was talking about so much good advice she was offering for junior developers and senior developers, and that episode is titled "How to Become a Better Developer." And yeah, that was just an hour's long worth of golden advice for developers, how to improve themselves both technically and well, both technically and, soft skills. So having what kind of soft skills you need. That was fantastic. And I've done all sorts of different interviews. I've got lots of interviews scheduled up as well. I'm actually interviewing tonight for a future podcast. I won't give a lot away on that yet. But again, that's going to be a fantastic interview because the person I'm interviewing is extremely passionate about coding, as with all the ones I've interviewed. And it's been such a lovely experience talking about people who are passionate and dedicated to coding and improving and mentoring. I've spoken to hiring managers. I've spoken to people who work in DevOps. I've spoken to people who are just front-end developers. I've spoken to people who have been in this industry for decades, and I've spoken to people who have just started learning to code, and also those who've come from different careers, so had completely different careers, and they've decided to switch and come into web development or programming, some form of coding. And it's just been such a lovely experience to speak to these guys and girls and get their sort of input and their advice. So do check that out. That's on How to Code Well. That is howtocodewell.fm. And also do check out Hostinger as well. That's hostinger.com/Peter Fisher for 82% off web hosting, and you get a free domain as well using that discount code Peter Fisher. You'll also get a further 15% off too. But anyway, let's crack on. Let's get these setters working. Let's actually start setting these things. So, because at the moment we kind of like got a half-built entity, so we have the ability to get the things. Now we need to actually set the things. So we're just going to do this one by one. So we're going to just, well, let's just copy this first. So all the way up to the top here, and we're going to copy that, and we're going to do test set reference. That's the first thing we're going to do, reference. So we don't need any of this stuff. But I tell you what we do need, is we do need that. So we're going to assert the same. Same is fantastic because it makes sure that you're not only checking for the value, but you're also checking that the data type of that value is the correct thing. You could do assert equals, but that's not checking the data type. So assert same. And this is going to be get reference. And we're going to just set the reference. So invoice set reference, and again, this hasn't been created yet, so this is going to fail. Reference. The reference is going to be ABC123, and we're going to check that the string ABC123 is what we actually return here. Let's bring that back a little bit. ABC123. Okay, so you can see that this is grayed out because we haven't actually created the setter routine. We're going to just change that to be set reference. I can run this individually now because I can run that, so I don't have to run all the 47 tests. I can just do G, boom, put that in, and that should just run that single individual test, and that test has failed. Call to method undefined, set reference. So that's what we need to do. We need to go into the invoice up here, and we need to do a public function set reference. This is going to be a string, and this is going to be reference, or it could just be value, but let's just do reference. If I can spell it, that would be lovely. And we're just going to do this reference is equal to reference. Now, we're going to do this in a chained way, so we're going to return this, which means that we can put it on here, invoice. Let's put in some comments. There we go. Okay. So running this, we should get the ability to get that back. That's fine, cool. So let's open up Invoice test. The next thing we need to do is we need to let's set the total and the VAT. Whoops. So set total. So again, this is a float, so we can do, let's do 1.50. Let's make it a little bit more, 100.50 or 5. And we're making sure that we have a float, so that's going to check the data type as well as, whoops, and we could do get total. What's going on here? Why can't that set same? Why is that expected? What have I done here? I've broken it. I've broken it. Why is that red? That's weird. That is the right number of... Oh, there we go. I had an extra bracket. Okay, so this is going to fail. Let's do set total, run that. That fails, and we can go back into here, the invoice. So this might seem a little bit laborious, and I guess when I do this, when I'm working on a client's work, what I do is I do a bunch of them, and then I run the test. So I might be running, I might build like 5 failing tests and then build it out. But I try not to do more than 5. Otherwise, if something breaks unexpectedly, then you end up with that broken plus 4 other things that are failing, and it can get quite tedious. This is a float. Okay, so let's run that. That worked excellent. Next thing is very similar. It's going to be VAT. Set VAT. Set VAT. I'm going to use an acronym because it is an acronym, not lowercase, VAT. And let's just change that to be 1, 2, 3. So that it's not going to make any sense in terms of calculation, but let's just run with this. VAT. Again, this should fail, which it does. So let's fill that out. Invoice. Set VAT. VAT. Again, it's a float. Again, we return the we return the object as well, and we return this. Okay, so let's run this and see. Hopefully that has fixed that. It has. Awesome. Okay, what's the next thing we need to do? So we've done reference, we've done total, and we've done VAT. We should also do the ID, and we should also do the date creations. However, because this is in the abstract, I might wait and do those later. I might think of another way of setting those. So things that are just invoice related. So we have a customer, we have items. So we can't really set a customer yet because we haven't built the customer, nor have we done the status. And the items, this is a tricky one because it's an array of items, so it's a collection. So when let's focus on the items for the moment. The items are, you could have multiple ways of doing this because it's a collection. You could be adding to that collection, or I should say an array. You're adding to that array. So you could have a add item method. You could also have a set items method. Set items would take an array and then run the add item. I think I've done this before in one of the validator bits and pieces. So there's two ways of doing this. You can either set all of them, or you could add one to that. If you set all of them, then perhaps you're overriding the ones that are already there. Yeah. And then obviously with the status, we would have to create the status and then set that to this. Same with the customer. So I think this is a good place to just sort of like, put a pause, because I need to now build out the other bits and pieces. So I think that the next stream I'm going to focus on is going to work through perhaps the items. So I'll be creating another entity, and I'll be doing it in a similar way, and then matching the two together, or associating the two together like this. But let's just run the test suite, all the units, and see where we actually are. So let's run the whole thing. So we have now 50 tests and 77 assertions. So I think we are in a good place. Nothing is broken in terms of the units at this stage, which is good. So yeah, I'm pretty chuffed, pretty happy with the progress. I think I'm going to commit this to the develop branch, and then we'll just continue. I believe that I might be streaming tomorrow at the same time. I need to double check. That is at 7:30 a.m. I need to double check a couple of things first, though. But do follow me on Twitter. That's at HowToCodeWell on Twitter, because I'll be putting out a notice when the next stream will be. But I'm hoping it's going to be tomorrow morning. And we'll be working through the invoice item. So I'll be creating an invoice item test here, and I'll be creating an invoice item class up there. Once I've decided upon the invoice, the data that represents the invoice item, I can then connect the invoice item to the invoice entity. And there we go. But thank you ever so much for watching. Happy coding, everyone. Have a good day. It's almost middle of the week. We have one more day before the middle of the week, and then we're another step closer to Friday, which is awesome. And of course, Friday we have the podcast, and also Friday we're coming very close to I think it's July the 4th. So you have American Independence Day over the pond. I'm in the UK here, so if I don't mention it, I probably will. If I don't see you before then have a great one. But yeah, thank you ever so much for watching. Happy coding, everyone, and I'll see you again hopefully tomorrow morning. Cheers. Bye-bye.